They said they can change. Maybe not in those words. Maybe it was, I'll work on it. Maybe it was, I didn't mean it like that. Maybe it was tears, a promise, a book they bought and never opened. But underneath all of it was the same unspoken contract. Give me time and I'll become someone different. So you waited. Maybe they went to therapy. Maybe they read the books. Maybe they even said the right things a few times. But for a moment, you thought, this is it. This is a turn. And then it wasn't. Today, we're not here to dump on your hope. Hope is not the problem. The problem is that nobody ever taught you how to evaluate what you were actually looking at. Change looks like change, except when it doesn't. And in a cluster B relationship, doesn't is far more common than anyone wants to admit. So let's get clear on what you're actually dealing with and what standard you should be measuring it against. Sam Vaknin points out that a rather stark truth. Fundamental change in cluster B pathology is extraordinarily rare. It's not impossible, but rare. He argues that cluster B personalities are not simply people with bad habits or unhelpful thinking patterns. They're people whose internal architecture is organized around a fundamental disruption. The self that should have developed a stable identity, a coherent core, was fractured early, usually by trauma and neglect or inconsistent caregiving. What grew in its place is a compensatory structure Vaknin calls the false self. The false self is not lying, it's not pretending, it's a genuine internal entity that formed to protect the child from unbearable pain. And like anything that forms for survival, it fights to stay alive. The false self is, he says, the most pathological mental structure I'm aware of, including schizophrenia. But the underlying dynamic he describes is consistent with decades of clinical observation. The structure that formed to protect the person becomes the structure that prevents them from changing. And the reason's simple. Change threatens the false self. Genuine internal transformation like therapy, intimacy, accountability, all of it requires the person to let go of the defensive structure or defensive architecture. And the false self won't do that. It interprets letting go as death, annihilation. So when you ask, can they change? You need to understand that inside the person, something is actively, fiercely resisting the very thing you're hoping for. I want to give you a really useful framework. It's a three-word distinction. Vaknin is pessimistic about fundamental change, but he also points out something that helps us see more clearly. Most of what people call change in a cluster B partner isn't change at all. It's one of the two things, or two other things. It's either modification. Modification is the person adapts their behavior for strategic reasons. They learn what triggers you, what keeps you in the relationship, what prevents consequences. The underlying dynamic don't shift, but the surface presentation gets optimized. It's behavioral engineering, not internal transformation. Or it's performance, modification or performance. Performance is the person mimics the behaviors of a healthy partner because they've learned that those behaviors produce desired outcomes. They say, I love you, the way an actor rehearses a line. They apologize in exactly the way that de-escalates the situation. There's no internal foundation, just a learned repertoire of effective moves. And then there's a third thing, which is change. Change is a genuine internal shift. Core psychodynamics transform. The person develops a capacity they didn't have before for accountability, for emotional honesty, for object constancy. This is extraordinarily rare in cluster B pathology, and Vaknin points out the reason why. The false self will not allow it. This is really important because because of its practicality. When you see your partner change, like when they go to therapy, when they stop a specific behavior, when they say the right words, you need to be able to ask, which of these three am I looking at? Because modification and performance can feel like change. They can look like change. They can keep you in the relationship for another year, another 5 years, waiting for change that never comes. Let's go deeper on the mechanism. Vecnin describes the false self as something that mummifies the true self. The true self, the part of the person that could have developed into a coherent, feeling, accountable human being, was so wounded early that the child essentially gave up on it. What replaced it is the false self, which is a godlike internal entity structure that manages a person's entire psychological economy. The false self regulates the person's mood through what Vecnin calls narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply is the attention, admiration, adulation, emotional responsiveness of other people. It maintains the person's sense of stability through grandiosity. It prevents regression into the emotional dysregulation that would occur if the false self were disabled. Crucially, the false self perceives genuine intimacy and accountability as existential threats. When a cluster B person encounters real emotional closeness, for example, in therapy, in a relationship, or even with a child, the false self stages two movies. It shows the person what their internal experience would be without the false self's protection, which are emotional dysregulation, abandonment anxiety, identity dissolution. It then offers the alternative: aggression, grandiosity, distance. The shared fantasy, the familiar pattern, this is why change feels like death to the person. It is, in the sense, the death of the defensive structure, which is the self-identity they've lived with all their life. And that structure will fight with everything it has, including destroying the relationships that might threaten it. There's another layer. Cluster B personalities don't develop internal regulation. They outsource it. The borderline outsources to intimate partners. The narcissist outsources to sources of supply broadly. Their emotional state is determined by external inputs, not by integrated internal world. When your entire psychological economy depends on external regulation, behavioral change doesn't come from the inside. It comes from adjusting to external conditions. That is modification, not change. Here's where it gets complicated and where a lot of people get fooled. In the longitudinal studies following BPD patients over time, suggesting that a significant number experience spontaneous symptom reduction by middle age, the behaviors that seemed so central to the diagnosis, which are like the impulsivity, the abandonment panic, the unstable relationships, diminish. The diagnosis may no longer apply. This is real. Gunderson and colleagues found in 2018 that roughly 50 to 60% of BPD patients no longer meet the criteria by age 40. Other longitudinal work supports the general trend, but this is important. What we're trying to get at in this video is this: spontaneous symptom reduction is not the same as behavioral change. The person may have fewer DSM symptoms, but that doesn't mean they've developed the capacity for genuine intimacy, accountability, or emotional honesty. It may simply mean that the most overt manifestations of the disorder have moderated with age, while the underlying architecture remains. And that's a trap. Your partner's therapist says they're making progress. Maybe they are, but by certain measures. But progress on a clinical scale is not the same as the kind of change that allows a healthy adult relationship to exist. And for covert narcissists, where the longitudinal evidence is limited, that covert or vulnerable narcissists show little meaningful change over the lifespan. This, the same dynamics, the same patterns, the same inability to access genuine intimacy. Vecni points out covert narcissists do not change over the lifespan. They remain the same. Same psychodynamics, same dysfunctional behaviors. The specific data on covert narcissism trajectories is less robust than for BPD. The pattern is stable across time in ways that feel impossible to interrupt. So what does this look like? Modification looks like this. Your partner has learned that screaming at you causes you to withdraw and then come back with extra attentiveness. So they've learned to modulate the screaming. They do it less frequently. They may even apologize afterward. A modified version of a behavior that preserves the function. The function is still there. The underlying dynamic, emotional dysregulation, managed through external intimidation, hasn't shifted. The person has just become more efficient at achieving the same outcome with less friction. Or it could look like this. Your partner has learned that crying and threatening self-harm after a conflict prevents you from enforcing a boundary. So they stop threatening and start a new approach. Withdrawal, silence, or making you feel guilty for needing space. Same function, different mechanism. Modification, performance, looks different. It looks like someone who has studied healthy relationship behavior and produces it on command. They say, I hear you. They say, how can I support you? They initiate conversations that follow the structure of effective communication, but there's flatness to it. It doesn't come from genuine empathy. It comes from a script. You can often feel the difference. Modification tends to be reactive. It emerges in response to specific triggers. Performance tends to be consistent but hollow. The person can do the right thing in the moment without the underlying emotional architecture that would make it sustainable across contexts. Vecni puts it this way. In Cluster B, we have a situation of either or. Either behavior modification or healing. We cannot accomplish both. His point is that when you see behavioral change, you can't assume it reflects internal transformation. The two are disconnected. So if you can rely on behavioral change as evidence of internal transformation, what can you use? A few signals that matter more than specific behaviors are: 1. Consistency across contexts. Does the person behave differently with you than with others, especially when they think no one is watching? Modification and performance are often context dependent. Genuine internal change tends to show up across contexts, not just in the relationship. Second thing you can look out for is response to boundaries. This is important. This is the most reliable indicator I've found. If you don't know how to establish boundaries, I strongly suggest you read the book OLNE. A person who is genuinely changing will experience your boundary as information, something to integrate and adapt to. A person who is merely modifying or performing will experience your boundary as a threat to be managed, evaded, or punished. Third thing you can look out for: duration over time. Change that sticks doesn't happen in weeks or months. If you're waiting for a fundamental internal shift in Cluster B partner, you should be looking at years, not months. 4. What the person does when no one's watching. The more private behavior diverges from public performance, the more likely you're looking at a performance, not change. The standard here matters. If you're waiting for modification to feel like change, you're always going to be disappointed. If you're waiting for performance to turn into something real, you'll be waiting a long time. The question, can they change, is not a bad question, but it puts you in the position of waiting for someone else's internal architecture to transform which is, as we've seen, is extraordinarily rare and largely outside of your control. The ideas in the book OLNE get you to ask a different question. And here's the question. Given who this person actually is, what can I build? One of the ideas in the book OLNE, co-independence, means you relate from completeness, not need. You don't need the other person to change in order for you to be okay. That's not coldness, it's clarity. It's the difference between a relationship where you're always negotiating with someone's pathology and a relationship where you're relating to a person. The reason co-independence is the right standard for cluster B dynamics, I think, is precisely this. You're not going to outlove their disorder. You're not going to be patient enough or kind enough or good enough to catalyze genuine change in someone whose false self has been running the show for 30 years. What you can do is decide what you will and won't accept. What you can do is hold boundaries without punishing. What you can do is stop pretending that modification is change and performance is intimacy. One of the three fundamental premises in OLNE, open communication, means you can name what you're seeing clearly without hostility, without performing false positivity. The other fundamental is non-judgmental acceptance, and it means you can accept what this is and who they are without accepting that you have to stay in the dynamic that's destroying you. And finally, non-conditional love means you can love someone and also leave them. It means the love doesn't require access. If you're in this right now, if you're with someone who promised to change and hasn't, or who changed on the surface and nothing underneath is different, I want to say something to you directly. You are not wrong for hoping. Hope is not the problem. The problem is when hope becomes a substitute for the clarity you need to make a real decision about your life. The question is not, can they change? The question is, what am I actually looking at? And if what you're looking at is modification, remember, modification is strategic behavioral adaptation that preserves the underlying dysfunction. You need to know that. Not because modification is worthless, but because it doesn't deserve the weight of your commitment. And if what you're looking at is performance being learned mimicry of healthy behavior with no internal foundation, you need to know that too, because performance can sustain a relationship for years. It can produce the appearance of intimacy, the motions of love, the theater of connection, but it cannot produce the real thing. And if what you're looking at is change, genuine internal shift, then you should be able to see it in the ways we've discussed. Consistency across contexts, response to boundaries, duration over time. The final thing I'll say on this is one of the most disorienting experiences in cluster B relationship is the moment you realize you've been relating to a defensive structure, not a person. That's not a condemnation on them. It's a clarification of the territory, and clarity is what OLNE is for. You don't need them to become someone else. You need to stop pretending they're already who you wish they were. That's not resignation, it's the beginning of every real choice you get to make from here. Know what you want, know who you are, know what you're not willing to tolerate from another person. That's going to be the foundation of every healthy relationship you'll ever have. Thanks for watching this series on sex, lies, and cluster B. Hopefully that helps. I'll see you on the next series. Enjoy this song from the album, Final Shared Fantasy.